Why don't you share with everyone what is secularism so that we can understand that before we go forward?
That's a great question. I pulled this definition off the internet, and I think it came from Britannica Online. So basically, what secularism is, it's a separation of religion from the rest of life, and then my interpretation of that goes on, where religion is regarded as irrelevant at best and evil at worst.
Mm.
And so, and then that particular definition went on to quote Charles Taylor, and where Taylor says, we don't have a really good idea. We don't have a clear, crisp, bumper sticker definition of secularism. So I think that a general definition that works really well is the separation of religion from the rest of life. And that has a lot of implications for a lot of different things. And I mentioned Charles Taylor. So this is the book where he actually writes about this. The book is 700 pages long. It's Charles Taylor, A Secular Age. It was put out in 2007, and he's a professor of philosophy at McGill University, or professor emeritus at McGill, and he traces the rise of secularism from the Middle Ages in Western Europe,
Okay.
because he's mostly interested in how it impacts North American culture. McGill is in Canada, so he's interested in how secularism has risen and influenced contemporary American culture, contemporary North American culture.
So is it safe to say that someone who believes in secularism or practices that they're seeing religion as a threat or as evil?
So what I've been doing recently is going on YouTube and just clicking on these different short videos, and you can see how people almost have visceral reactions when
Hmm.
you mention God or the Bible or any sort of a religious, conversation or religious words. That some of them get really agitated and angry when you mention religion.
Hmm.
So yeah, there could be those kinds of people, and then there's other people who are either um, armchair agnostic, armchair atheistic. It's part and parcel of who they are. They don't get really agitated about it, but for them, God may or may not exist. But for them, it doesn't matter whether God exists. God is totally irrelevant to how they conduct their lives, to how they behave, to how they make decisions. It's just, it's whatever. That's a really, in the worst sense, it's whatever.
So, as we seek to understand this first step of understanding what we're talking about today in secularism, are most people who are secularists or believe in secularism or practice that, do they even understand that they are doing that, or what might they call it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So this gets into, I don't know what they would call it, actually. I don't, this is where um, this backs up into a larger conversation about this idea of worldviews,
Okay.
and that um, Britannica actually mentions secularism as the result of a worldview belief. And so
Hmm.
I don't know if they would call themselves secularists as much as they might call themselves not religious, agnostics, stuff like that.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So, and you mentioned worldview. It kind of sounded like you meant that in a negative way, or maybe it falls in line with secularism. When I think of worldview, it's kind of something that each person adopts, how they see the world. How would you describe it?
Same thing, right? Excuse me. So, Christians for a lot of years back in the 70s and 80s, it seems as though, this idea of a worldview was pretty much owned by the Christians. It was actually coined by Immanuel Kant, this idea of a Weltanschauung,
Okay.
which is the German word for worldview. But it was kind of owned by the Christians up until, I would say, 15 years ago, where it began to creep more and more into popular conversation. So what a worldview is those sets of beliefs that you embrace, that you hold, in order to run your life. I talk about worldview in some of the classes that I teach, and this idea of a worldview is how you view life, how you interpret those events that happen in your life. For example, Charles Sire has had put out a series of editions of The Universe Next Door, which he poses 7 worldview questions, and then you can kind of figure out what your worldview is depending on the answers to those questions. Many different people have different sets of questions. For the purposes, I think, of this conversation, I think that the 4 questions about anybody's worldview is simply, number 1, who are you? Number 2, where are you? Number 3, what's wrong? And number 4, how do you fix it?
That's interesting. I've never heard someone express it that way, especially the what's wrong. Tell me about that. How does that fit into worldview?
Okay, so here's a real simplistic example, and it's a surface level, and we can certainly go deeper. But for example, I have a toothache. I need to go get it fixed. So who am I? Well, I'm a dentist patient, right? Where am I? I'm in his office. I'm in the dentist's office. What's wrong? I've got a toothache, right? How do you fix it? Well, I'm gonna sit down in the chair. The dentist is gonna look at it, and then he's gonna tell me how to fix it. So if you take a look again, so now to expand it a little bit bigger, if you take a look at the world around us, um, I'm looking at my lawn, right? Okay, so now I'm a homeowner. Where am I? I'm out in my yard, right? What's wrong? The grass is long. Well, what's the problem? Well, cut it. And so, now let's go to the community. Well, what's wrong? Well, we don't have enough public services. So who am I? Okay, I'm a member of community. Where am I? I'm at some sort of a public meeting. All right, what's wrong? Well, we've got, concerned citizens have a list of shortcomings
Okay.
or problems that they want to see fixed. What's the solution? It's going to this meeting, talking to the public officials, and trying to get some traction on some proposed ways of fixing what's wrong. The assumption that most people don't even know that they have is that there is something wrong with the world. Every day they get up in the morning, they have to fix stuff. Stuff breaks on its own. Stuff breaks down on its own. So every day we have to get up. We identify those things that are wrong or those things that need to be improved. And then in our various roles, father, teacher, citizen of a community, churchgoer, right? We identify what those various problems are, and then we go about fixing them with the experience and the knowledge that we have, with the community within, that we live in. We'll go about fixing those things that are wrong. And again, the larger overall assumption is that things are always going to need improving.
Mm.
At some level, whether it's basic or developed or what have you, the world is broken, right? I mean, there are parts of our world that are broken, and so our worldview, what's wrong? It assumes that there's something wrong, that something is broken, that something needs fixing, and that we're going to go about trying to fix it.
Mm. So if this was kind of a funnel shape and we're talking about, and we're going to put these things in there, what comes first? Is it first the worldview that is the larger part, or secularism?
So the worldview is a set of those questions. It's a framework by which you understand life. And so as you develop your world, as an individual develops their worldview, and by the way, lots of the components of anybody's worldview is shared by other people, because usually it's done in community.
Okay.
The development of your worldview, Daniel, is done in some sort of a community, whether it's the church, whether it's some other social group that you're with. You talk about it, you develop your worldview, so it's typically done in community.
Would you say it's almost impossible to not be affected by the worldview of others around you in your community then?
Yes, and this is where the worldviews play off of each other. when it comes to the developing of my worldview, I've studied this for, I don't know, 20 years. And, I've looked at Sayre's. Sayre has 8 questions. I've looked at Sayre's questions, and he's pretty quick to say, look, you answer these worldview questions to develop your worldview, but don't forget your worldview influences your culture, for example, which is a source of a worldview. But then your culture influences your worldview. And so there's this give and take between, your community, however big or however you describe that, and the development of your worldview. So it informs, culture, for example, culture and politics informs worldview. Your worldview informs politics and culture.
So for the atheist and the agnostic, is a worldview almost like religion to a Christian, or is it different?
All right. So, yes, the answer to your question is yes. So here's why. And I need to get back to this idea of this development of secularism as separation from religion,
Okay.
from the rest of your life. So Taylor traces the rise of secularism, and he starts back in the Middle Ages, where there was this great integration between between the immanent, which is our world,
Mm-hmm.
and the transcendent, which is, I'll basically define that as God's world. The two were together,
Okay.
such that somebody would say, "Oh, I'm sick. That must be because I sinned."
Mm.
Right? There's this natural connection between the immanent world, the world in which we live, and God's world, the transcendent world,
Okay.
which He lives in. And people saw that God interacted. Right? There was always this interaction between God and the supernatural world, right? Between the supernatural world and our world. That's this relative mix, this relative integration of the transcendent with the immanent. Over time, though, again, the transcendent began to separate from the immanent, right? And then there became more and more of a barrier, what I will call a barrier, a line between the transcendent and the immanent. And so, for example, back in the 1700s, when science began to be developed, the transcendent was no longer needed. It was excused because we thought science had all the answers to all the problems. Right.
So it was kind of pushing it out of the culture, if you will.
Yep. It became, again, this is where religion became more and more irrelevant. Not needed.
Interesting.
We diagnosed diseases in terms of health as opposed to sin, right?
Okay.
I'm sick because of a germ, not because of a sin. And so, there's this, again, this great, and so God was excused. God was pushed off stage. All right. But the problems, the things that a worldview addresses were still there. But so a secular worldview has to address those problems in a different way. And so what a secularist will do, for example, when it comes to salvation, because that's still an issue. And by salvation, I mean, what's wrong? That this question of what's wrong is, you can the religious question for that is, how am I saved? Well, you still got to figure that out. You still got to answer that question. So for a secularist, they wouldn't say, well, God saves you, right? Because God is no longer an option. What they'll say is, our government will save you.
Okay.
Right? And so for them, life, there is no life after death. Life after death doesn't matter. There's no justice after death. There's no heaven. There's no hell. Nothing happens. You just decompose. And so everything that has to do with salvation has to be done this side of death. And what better way to do that? The best way to accomplish that is through your government, right?
Okay.
And so the government becomes the means of your salvation.
So it's almost like they're trading a religion for something they're not calling a religion, and they're trading God for government. Is that safe to say?
That's exactly right. I mean, yes, exactly right. And so government becomes a secular religion. Government becomes a secular God, not a secular religion.
Okay.
Government becomes a secular God. Everybody has faith. You don't not have faith, right? You don't, you might stop having faith in God, but you don't stop having faith in the government. Um,
Okay.
and we can expand this concept of faith and what it actually means. I mean, every time I sit down in my car and turn the key, I have faith that the engine's going to
Sure.
turn over, right?
So,
So I walk into a room full of a group of politicians. I there's faith there that they're going to behave like people that like they should behave, that they're going to try and solve problems. And so yeah, it's uh, for a secularist, government is a secular religion for sure. Yep.
interesting. So where does that put the Christian as far as understanding these different things, but also empathizing? I mean, I can see from one area, if I didn't believe in God, I mean, you're still going to have that void. You're still going to feel like you want to be taken care of. So I get it. And also, it's not that far off. God talks in the Bible about, instituting government and
Right.
obeying your
Right.
leaders. So there's definitely a necessity there. It's just that the Christian would see that, yes, there still is a God, but he oversees the government.
Right. So this is where I think, and I'm going to localize this to the United States, right?
Okay.
So this is where I think Christians have to understand that they are citizens in two kingdoms,
Mm,
and they have 2 feet planted squarely in two kingdoms,
got
right?
it.
It's not like I've got 1 foot in the kingdom of God and 1 foot in the United States of America.
Hmm.
I'm solidly a citizen, a resident of the United States, and I'm solidly a member of the kingdom of God. And so we have to think like that, right?
Yeah.
And again, historically, for the most part, there's been a great overlap between a biblical Christian sense of the world and how the United States is. But there seems to be more of a detangling, an unwinding of those two strands. So I think you have to. It's not like you're going to be schizophrenic, but you have to think in two ways. You have to think in a way that is going to bring about the kingdom of God, right? The Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be Thy kingdom come, Thy will be done. You have to think like that all the time, and then you also have to think about what it means to be a citizen of the United States. And typically, there's not going to be a whole lot of times when those two ideas, those two strands conflict. But I think if they do, each Christian has to think this through, again, in accordance with their worldview, but they have to think this through, what it means to obey God rather than man. Acts 5:29, I think Peter there is
Okay.
talking. And you've got to make up your mind on what that looks like. And it's that's as far as I can take it in terms of how you see things, because every individual Christian is going to see things different.
Yeah, I think this is really, really important to understand and to grasp. I think it's so important that we are empathetic to both sides, that we're understanding. I mean, we all have that, what we would call that God-shaped void. And
Mm-hmm.
we might wonder, why are people on the other side so incredibly passionate about something that we completely disagree with? And I think at the end of the day, it just comes down to, we were made to worship something. We were made to be passionate people. We were made to accomplish great things. And it just so happens that they're doing it the best way that they believe. Jesus said about the people who killed him on the cross, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important that we don't just dismiss the people on the other side of the aisle, but kind of understand, number one, why are they acting that way, and know that they're being just as passionate as us, maybe even more passionate sometimes, but in their mind, it's a legitimate, real reason, and it's a quest to do what they think is right, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes. I think yes to all of that. I think people, if I were to approach people and say, "Look, you're acting like a religious zealot,"
Hmm.
they would go, "No, I'm not." I'm going, "Well, yeah, you are. You're just as passionate about your beliefs as I am about mine." Um, So that's the beginning of it. Is that they are looking for salvation in a place that Christians don't,
Hmm.
and so their zealousness, their desire to get things right is totally understandable. But I think where we would not agree is where they're looking for the solution, or how they see, the salvation of solution, how that looks. There's where we would disagree, but the idea that they're looking for it, absolutely, that makes total sense to me. That the fact that they're passionate, absolutely, totally get that. And yeah, so that's
I think even more so, it kind of brings this desire then for us to be even more understanding, even more merciful, even more gracious and patient, just like God is with us. But when we went out for a drink and talked, it really hit home with me when you described, Daniel, we are looking forward to heaven. We are looking forward to eternal life, something that is joyful next. People that are not looking forward to that, this is it. So they're
right.
going to work as hard as they possibly can, be fierce and be a fighter for their cause, because at the end of the day, this is it.
Yeah, at the end of the day, that's the end of the day. And
Hmm.
so yeah, I mean, there's more at stake, which I think explains a lot about our contemporary political culture right now. That both sides, whatever, any side, because there seems to be this general secular overlay, where anything about the afterlife, anything about God, anything about religion is set aside, excused. Everything has to take place right now, and so
Hmm.
there's this almost this desperation,
Yeah.
to get it right, because it matters so much. Politics, this side of death, matters so much more than they used to, because of this idea of secularism.
So we've discussed secularism. We've discussed some about worldview. What challenges do Christians face when upholding biblical principles in a culture that really seems to promote moral relativism?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, in my I've spent 25 years or so teaching Christians in college. Not just Christians, but I've spent 25 years in colleges and universities teaching. Um, and there has been this impact beyond almost beyond measure by postmodernism, and it has the two most popular ways that it has impacted our culture is this idea of what is true for you is not necessarily true for me. And what that does is that relativizes truth.
Hmm.
The problem is, Christians pick up on that and they run with that. That if Christians are not thoughtful about what that is actually saying, they'll believe it, because this gets into the idea that they have stories that no one else has, they have truths that no one else has, and it seems to validate this idea, who they are as individuals. But this idea of what is true for you is not necessarily true for me. It's it's not true. I mean, when you
Yeah.
think about it, when you think about it, it actually contradicts itself, because the statement "what is true for you is not necessarily true for me" has to be true for both of us. Because if you tell me that, you're assuming that I'm going to believe it, that it's true. It's clear that you think it's true, um, and you're expecting me to believe that it's true too. But really, the meaning of that gives me the permission not to believe it. So it gets really confusing. But because Christians haven't thought this through, they buy into it, and so they turn out to be postmodern Christians in a world that we're trying to fight postmodernism, or trying to correct postmodernism, or respond to postmodernism.
Okay.
And so Christians who aren't aware of what's actually going on there buy into it, and it makes my job that much harder.
So
Um,
let me just clarify just a little bit, if I could.
yeah,
So when you're saying what's true for you is not necessarily true for me, we're not talking about things like, I grew up here and you grew up there, or I grew up with a dad and not a mom, and you grew up with a mom and not a dad. We're really kind of focusing more on these absolute truths or moral truths. Is that correct?
yes. But when you think about it, all truth is true. Whether it's, I mean, truth by nature is absolute. And so,
Okay.
yes, I've had people say to me, "It's not your truth that you were that you had only one parent growing up. It's my truth." And I'm
Okay.
thinking, well, no, that's not your truth. It's the truth.
Hmm.
It's the truth for both you and me that you grew up with only one parent, right?
So we hear that a lot, don't we? My truth, my truth.
Right, right.
And
And I'm thinking,
what are people really saying when they say my truth?
I think what they want to claim is an exclusive story. They want to, again, this, and I'm playing amateur armchair psychologist here,
Okay.
but it's the psychology of I'm important, I'm recognized, I'm special. It's my truth, and you can't take it away from me, right? That's what I think is going on here. And the only thing I correct with that is no, no, it's true for me and you that you grew up with only one mom. Not to take away from the impact of it, not to take away from the experiences, not to take away from the difficulty, the struggle of growing up with only one parent. I get that. But the truth is, it's true for both of us, not just you.
So, what do we do then when our culture pushes on us to accept the my truth when it's not true, or it's not,
Yeah.
we know it's not true? What should our
Yeah.
Christian response be?
So again, I've, um, okay, so it's going to have to be something like this. Well, wait a second. And this is where things can get belligerent really fast. And again, this gets back to knowing who you're talking to as an individual. But the idea would be, wait a second, is that true or is that an opinion? Right? And then if it's an opinion, do you have what? Do you have evidence for that? Do you have data for that? You want to tell me that the earth is flat and that it's your truth. Is that actually true? I mean, where are you typically how it comes out for me is where are you getting that from?
Yeah.
Right. And then if it's a personal opinion, I go, oh, personal opinion. Well, how far can you go with that? And so that starts to lighten up things and move things away from my truth is my truth and it doesn't belong to you and all that.
Yeah.
Um, so I just have a conversation digging deeper into what it is that they actually mean when they say something like that.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes, to be honest, it almost feels like for people who are saying my truth, it's non negotiable, right? Like it's you, this is my truth. You will
Right,
respect my truth and you will celebrate my truth or
right,
succumb to my wrath.
right. Yeah. So this is where again the national conversations tends to get belligerent really quick, which is why I kind of want to sidestep the whole national
Yeah.
conversation and talk to the individual that I'm talking with. And this presumes that I know them fairly well. This presumes that we are going to have a relatively calm conversation where we are allowed to, speak our mind, um, even when we disagree, and how we should practice the best skill set that we have in terms of letting the other person speak, not interrupting, letting them talk without listening to come up with a response. It's just letting them tell their story because it unfolds into more things than just what it is that they just said. So,
That's such an important point. And I know for some people, this particular issue has moved into the workplace. It's moved
right.
into sports. It's moved into all kinds of different places in our culture and in our lives. Any advice other than meeting one on one, being patient and kind? Any other advice to people who might be struggling with that issue that they strongly differ with, that has found them at work or found them in another place where they go in their community?
Yeah. Um, No, I think you can say you can you can say your piece, right? You can make your response, be as civil and as mature and as thoughtful as possible, and then you have to stop talking, and then you have to live the Christian life of tolerance, right? Because there comes a point where you're going to run out of things to say. You have to work with that individual. So now, you put on your big boy pair of pants and you work with that individual and be the best professional you can possibly be. And
Yeah.
then let your life play out so that they can see you as a credible source, as a believable source, one with whom they are willing to engage.
What a good point. Thank you
Yeah.
for sharing on that. I know it's coming up for a lot of people. A lot of people have been facing that, so I really appreciate you addressing it.
Yeah. The other piece to this is, if that's the first statement, the second statement, and we've heard this, is what is moral for you is not necessarily moral for me. And that's the same sort of argument is, well, wait a second, what just exactly what are you saying here? Because I think this is similar, but this is a little bit different in that you have to, where I have to go is I have to get these people to think about this idea, whoever it is I'm talking to. In this case, it's mostly students, but they're adults, they're adult working students. Is this idea of universal moral principles, and that we all know what this word ought means in the moral sense without ever having it explained to us. Well, you ought not to have done that, right? Well, the conversation is not about the word ought. We all know what that word means. The conversation is whether or not that particular activity I should or should not have done,
Hmm.
right?
Okay.
So that's and then you can go back to this: what is moral is not necessarily moral for me. Well, this is where you got to again talk to them as an individual. What do you mean by that? And then why isn't it moral for the both of us? And then this depends a lot on the relationship that you have with the person.
Yeah.
But when they say this, what is moral for you is not necessarily moral for me. Or don't judge me. That's
Right.
another popular phrase. Don't judge me. Well, wait a second. What is moral for you is that not itself a moral judgment? Right? And then when they say don't judge me, well, wait a second. Isn't that statement predicated on a moral judgment that it's immoral for me to judge you? So, I mean, you can call them out on this sort of stuff, but it's never as fun as you would think that it is in your head, because you're actually calling them out, and that could be really discomforting. So again, you got to move them back towards this idea of moral principles, consistency between moral principles and moral beliefs, consistency between moral beliefs and moral behavior. And this takes time. You have to get to know them as an individual and just have the conversation.
And that just brings home the other things that we're going to get into as well, where this is happening in our community, with our
Right.
neighbors, and how God wants us to get involved personally with people and making friendships and serving our neighbors, serving our community,
Right.
and doing life with each other.
Yeah. Yeah. And the word tolerance has gotten a bad rap lately, right? I happen to think that the word tolerance is a very good word. Um, and I think it's the best way that describes how we get along with people with whom we disagree, right? We we tolerate them, and again, that sounds pretty cold and pretty negative, but I think that's the place to start. We
Yeah.
tolerate them, right? They, and then we take it from there.
Well,
So
he tells us in his word, doesn't he? I want to say it's Isaiah 5:20, but I think I'm wrong. But so much as it is up to you to live at peace with one another,
right,
right?
right, yeah, yeah, yep, and that's the whole idea.
So who would you say is winning the thought battle? Who would you say is winning in the universities and in government and in life and culture? Is it the side that is pushing for regarding religion as evil and regarding religion as something that's in the way and moving towards government more? What have you seen?
Yeah. Um, boy, just a second. I'll be right back after I consult my crystal ball. You know, um, I have no idea who's winning. I want to reinterpret your question to what can I do, right?
Sure.
What can I do to do what I can to win, if that's the right expression. Um, with being a Christian, I'll have the long view in mind. At
Yeah.
the end of the day, truth is going to win, right? Whether it doesn't matter, what kind of truth, whether it's political conservative truth, whether it's political liberal truth, whether it's culture truth, whether it's justice truth. At the end of the day, truth is going to win. All
Yeah.
truth is God's truth, and so since God is going to prevail, truth is going to prevail. Right. So with that vision in mind, that uh, I think I have the responsibility of always working towards truth, working towards the kingdom of God. And so, I do what I can with my students, with people that I meet, to understand where they're coming from and try and figure out how I can reveal the truth, how I
Hmm.
can reveal truth, with whatever we are talking about. And of course, with a lot of our national conversations today, it's not just truth, it's compassion. I
Okay.
have to have this compassionate, empathetic attitude to talk truth. And so I don't know about the big overall picture. All I know is the people that I deal with, the people that I interact with. How can I advance the kingdom of God with them?
Yeah. So we've talked about secularism. We've talked about worldview. Where does identity politics fit into all of this?
Yeah, I thought about that. The first time I heard about identity politics is my brother asked me that a couple of years ago, and I said no. He asked me about intersectionality, and I think this is where intersectionality and identity politics are related. And
Okay.
so the way that I picture it is this matrix, this like table of 4x4 or 5x5 with all of these different subsections: gender,
Okay.
age, ethnicity. And so you got, like, I don't know, 25 different identities, right? And so when it comes to identity politics, you scribble in which of the sub-factors, which of the different categories
Hmm.
you click, or you fit into. So, for example, I would be a white guy, a white male, over 65, right? I will say, middle income American. And so I would
Hmm.
scribble all those boxes off and see which ones are not marked, and then try and figure out which identity I fit into based on all those boxes that
Hmm.
I filled in. Um, that's one way of doing it. That's very abstract. And so I would find myself in a group, right? Somehow I would eventually be slotted into, oh, you're this group over here, sort of like my astrological sign, right? Well, the problem with that is that now you get into this idea of stereotyping the entire group. Well, since you fit into this group, you must be this way. And I'm thinking, that's not a good way to look at it. And so I think what we have to do, um, whether we're Christian or not, but since, as a Christian, I don't want to get into the identity politics conversation, because
Okay.
it doesn't do any good. I think the way to go is, again, to treat each individual as an individual, and listen to their story, and try and figure out where they're coming from, um, and sidestep the whole identity politics conversation.
Yeah. I definitely, Jesus kind of did that, didn't he? It was very strange for him to lift children up and to raise children up to be like, talk about being like a child. I think in that culture, in that time, children were not looked at something that you necessarily want to model yourself after.
Right.
And he
Right.
really kind of flipped the tables, didn't he? Now, he didn't agree with many of the things that we could talk about with identity politics and things, but that wasn't his focus, like you're saying. I mean, his focus even more so was the Pharisees. He had a problem with
Right.
them. He had a problem with religious leaders.
Yeah, right. You have to address. I mean, at the end of the when you speak with someone, you're actually speaking to an individual. You're not speaking to a package of beliefs. You're not speaking to a package of ideas. There's so much more going on when in a one-on-one interaction with an individual. They've got a story. And so they may bring in identity politics. And I think that I think you have to be aware of what identity politics are. You have to be aware of what the conversation is. You have to be aware of various elements of it. Um, so you have to be informed, but I think individuals are individuals, and I think people, and I think what does work for us in this day and age is the fact that people do want to be recognized as individuals. So that's essentially what we have to do. And yes, Christ was really countercultural in that way, and I think we can, if we demonstrate a genuine concern for the individual, a genuine interest for the individual, I think that goes a long way to having meaningful conversations.
That's the truth. I mean, Jesus just set the perfect example. I love this story in Mark. I think it's Mark 7:33 about this man who has a tangled tongue and he can't hear. And it's one of the few miracles in the Bible where it actually says that he pulled him aside, like he pulled him away from everyone else. And I can just picture him and this man there. It's the one where he put spit on his fingers and touched his
Yeah.
tongue.
Yeah.
And Jesus did it best by being able to meet people where they are, meet them one-on-one, and show them the incredible value that they are. Because after all, we're each created in God's image.
Right. Yeah, I think, that one-on-one, individual to individual, and that takes time, right?
Yeah.
And we can't look at people as marks, right? As targets. We can't look at them as, objects. You just have to engage them as individuals.
Well, we know that Jesus says that our battle is not with flesh and blood, right? So
Right.
it's too easy, isn't it, for things going on in our culture to look at people as a statement or to look at them as an idea rather than as a person, and to
Right.
remember that there's a greater battle going on. There's a greater battle going on, and we in many ways are being confused. Things are being distorted so that we're kind of at war with each other.
Yeah, and again, that requires a great deal of self-awareness, and having a good understanding of the conversations that are going on in the public square, because that's how people are going. People are going to approach me as a stereotypical Christian if they know who I am. Right?
Yeah.
They're gonna use all the language and all the rhetoric of how they view Christians. And so I have to be, so when I approach somebody, I have to be aware of what my predispositional beliefs are. You could probably interpret that as what my stereotypes might be.
Mm-hmm.
I have to be aware of what the conversation is. I have to be aware of how I respond to those conversations. And I have to be careful to treat this individual as an individual without any preconceived ideas of who or what the kind of person that they might be.
Absolutely. And boy, that is kind of the opposite of what's going on right now. I mean, just on social media and even with the candidates. I mean, if you were watching the news at any time during any election, you're going to see the people on one side saying terrible things about the other candidate.
Right.
You're going to see the other side bringing up everything they can about the opposing candidate. And you no longer look at them as a person. You don't no longer look at them as, it being fair or creating God's image. It's just what the media, what other sources are telling you are their worst flaws, their worst moments.
Right.
Is that something that we should take into account when we do vote?
That's a really good question. So back in my former lifetime, many years ago, I was a newspaper reporter for a very small town newspaper for a couple of years. And so I it was a small town, 10,000 circulation. So it was not for a major newspaper. I don't know if I can really count myself as a member of the media, even though I did work at a newspaper. But what was really interesting was the story, right? I mean, this was back in the 90s before social media and the internet.
Okay.
And I had a primary responsibility of getting the story right. Um, and the cool thing about working in such a small environment was I would have people walk up to me in the street and tell me, "You got that wrong." It would not be a letter to the editor, right? It would not be a phone call, but they would come up and talk to me and say, no, this you got that wrong. So there was this built-in sense of accountability and transparency
Yeah.
that made me careful on how I reported anything um, over the years. And so that was my experience. I learned a lot about the media and how it works. And I am of the belief right now that I don't know who to believe.
Yeah.
I because everybody's going to put their own story out, and it's really hard to get. I kind of don't believe in this sense of being objective, um, because being objective implies this idea of some sort of an abstract, depersonalized sense of the
Yeah.
truth, when in fact there is no such thing as a depersonalized truth.
So you're almost saying, even if you come at it as a reporter, it might be impossible to not have a little bit of a spin or a little bit of a bias.
No, what I'm saying is it's not objective, but it can be fair,
Oh, okay. Yes.
right? I dismiss the sense of objectivity, but I do have this obligation and responsibility of being fair, right? So it could be the case, very much could be the case, Daniel, that I'm not going to report the entire story.
Mm,
I don't have that much space in the paper, right?
okay.
But I do have the responsibility of being absolutely accurate and fair in what I do report.
Yeah.
So if I'm writing a pro candidate story, I have no responsibility of telling the entire story. Maybe I can't.
Yeah.
I have no responsibility of reporting on the other candidate,
Mm,
but I do have the responsibility of being fair in what I do report.
yeah.
And when I read online stories, I cannot make heads or tails out of whether or not what I'm reading is fair.
Yeah.
And that puts me at a disadvantage for trying to figure out what is actually going on. Um, sooner or later, sooner or later, you're going to find sources that you trust in terms of who's being fair, and this requires time. You have to, whether it's a podcast, an individual, or whether it's some sort of a website, or if it's an online newspaper,
Yeah.
you have to figure out where that source is coming from, what their worldview is, their spin on things, and then you can take that into account as you listen to them and as you read them. And this takes time, and you can't do it 4 weeks before an election, 6 weeks. You can't do it. You have to spend, I don't know, a good year in reading these sources,
Yep.
trying to figure out where they're coming from, before you can start to believe what it is that they're actually saying.
So when we exercise that sacred right to vote, what does God want us to include in our thought process? So there's so many different variables, and I think it's very easy to kind of go with the emotional route. What does he
Mm-hmm.
want us to include in the factors when we make that decision?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Excuse me. Um, I want to cast this a little bit differently than this idea of a sacred. What did you call it? A sacred
Right to
sa-
vote, or
sacred right. Okay. So after this podcast ends, I'm going to walk away and I'm going to think about this idea of a sacred right more, because I think that it's not sacred.
mm-hmm.
On the face of it, it's not sacred. It's not a religious idea. I don't think it's a moral obligation.
Okay.
Um, it's not sacred in the sense of other sorts of religious beliefs that we have. Um, And yet, so I'm not sure if it's sacred. I want to disconnect it from. I want to disconnect the idea of voting from any sort of a moral responsibility that we might have,
Okay.
um, because once you start getting into this field of moral responsibilities, to fail a moral responsibility is to sin.
Okay.
So I'm not convinced that because I don't vote, I sin. That's
Okay.
where I'm headed. I want to lift. I want to pull that off of this idea of voting. That we're going to condemn Christians for sinning if
Mm-hmm.
they don't vote. Um, so I that's my first comment. My second comment is I think that you should again. This gets back to your worldview. You should have this some sense of what's important to you
Okay.
in the context of your worldview when it comes to trying to figure out who to vote for, the qualifications, right? Um, for me personally, I was trained as a philosopher, and as a Western European, philosopher, Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, that whole background. There's this thing called ad hominem arguments, and where you attack the person, and the idea of it is by attacking the person, you attack the argument.
Mm-hmm.
When that's not true at all. Personal attacks on any of the candidates are exactly that, personal attacks.
Yeah.
They don't have much. They don't have much to do with the truth of what they're saying, the stance of their positions. So for me, that doesn't gain very much traction. Whatever the name calling, that doesn't. It's disgusting. It shouldn't happen. But to me, it's not relevant. Um, you could say, well, wait a second. These ad hominem attacks get to the character of the individual. This is true. I mean, you have to measure the character of the individual. But again, this gets back to what are the stories that you're hearing. And then the question is how important is the character of the individual? And then I think the other thing you have to consider is their their competence, right?
Yeah.
Their experience and competence for the job. I don't, when you're looking at the presidential elections, right? Jimmy Carter, back in the 1970s, was a very public, committed evangelical Christian. There's no doubt. It's one of the first things I learned about him, after he was president, was that he
Mm-hmm.
was a Christian. But then, if you take a look at his record, there's a debate within the talking political science heads about how effective he was as a president. So the would you rather, for Christians is, would you rather have a committed Christian who doesn't know what he's doing, or would you rather have somebody who's not a Christian but who's competent to fulfill the office, the obligations of the presidency? And I
Yeah.
think that's what you have to measure too. This is somewhat simplistic, but I think that you have to consider who you're voting for, like a job interview.
Yeah.
Do they have, you are interviewing your candidate as a job candidate,
Yeah.
and then you have to ask them all the questions that you would in a normal job interview. So
Good point. I think we would probably differ a little bit on, or maybe not, we could discuss it, but the seriousness of voting and the reason we should vote, I think I would probably agree with you. I don't know if it is a sin to not vote, but what I do know is that God was not very pleased with the person who he gave talents to, and they buried it. I also know when we don't make a choice, we are making a choice.
right.
And I also know that in the past, God was not pleased when the people chose bad leaders. So I think we need to take voting, the opportunity to vote, very seriously, especially considering the hundreds of thousands of people who have died to protect our country.
Right.
But I would agree with you. I couldn't say beyond a shadow of a doubt, is it a sin not to vote? I think ultimately, if someone is just so conflicted, they don't know. They've gone and maybe talked to their pastor, talked to their friends, they've done their homework, and they do not know who to vote for, then I would probably say maybe you don't vote. If your conscience truly cannot discern what is right and what is wrong, then maybe you don't. But I
Right.
think it's definitely worth remembering the people who have passed serving our country, remembering the stories from the Bible where, you know, God is not a big fan of us just sitting on our hands and letting things happen. Would you agree with
Right.
that?
Yeah. The larger background is this idea of withdrawing from culture.
Mm,
Um, I don't see, Christians are supposed to be engaged in culture. We're supposed to be engaged in our community. And if you're not voting because you have decided that you are going to be a hermit, um,
okay.
good, good luck with that. But if you decide because you're going to withdraw from culture, that's not the right reason to not vote.
So,
Um,
in other words,
so
I'm a Christian. I'm going to have eternal life. I don't need to be involved with these people are doing that. From your perspective, that's not
yeah,
good.
no, because I mean, again, we're supposed to be involved with bringing about the kingdom of God, and
Yeah.
that means we have to interact with culture.
There's this. Are we good, guys? So there's this huge energy. There's this huge energy. I would say in the Democratic Party when I say anything about Trump that might be positive. Not even saying I'm voting for him, but it always comes back to, he's the Antichrist. You're following him and not Jesus. And I would just like you to touch on that because I do think that there is probably some people that are looking at Donald Trump as a figure of salvation in some ways.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
I do probably think that there is some need for correction there. But share with me, I mean, people went through the streets chanting, David killed his 10,000s, and they
Hmm.
you find these different leaders. They're not a Christ figure, not someone who's bringing about salvation, but in that time, in that day, they're making a change that you feel like is going to change your life, fix things, move things in the direction that you would like. How do we balance that between looking at someone as almost a Christ figure, keeping Jesus where he belongs, but also being very realistic about wanting food to cost less, wanting
Yeah.
taxes to be lowered?
Yeah. Um, so the way that I do this is I first off in the United States we have somehow, and I don't know how we did this. I'm not a political science historian by any means. We have landed on a two-party system,
Hmm.
which is mind-boggling to me, especially when you take a look at Europe and the multi-party systems that they have over there. So the fact that we're a two-party system is somewhat of a mystery to me. I just think that there's room for a third party, at least a third party,
Hmm.
and of course you can get into Perot and all of these past third party candidates, and I will have people tell me uh, the third party person doesn't work. And our most recent example is RFK, where he went nowhere. Um, but that doesn't stop me from wanting to push for a third party. It
Yeah.
doesn't stop me from wanting to think that a third party would be good. Um, that's my first comment. My second comment is I think that people are going to come and go, right? Um, for those who are Trump detractors, they are pie in the sky happy that this is the last time that he can run. Um, and then you've got uh, Kamala supporters. Hey, she can run again. This idea that um, we have to get beyond the personalities because people will come and go.
Yeah.
You know, I think a lot of conservatives would be happy if we could resurrect some sort of a Reagan-esque figure
Hmm.
who, by many conservative accounts, was the most best recent conservative president we ever had.
Hmm.
People come and go, but the parties don't and the beliefs don't. And so what I try and do is I choose to vote along party lines and not the individual.
Hmm.
Um, because if I'm dyed in the wool, if I really believe that the Democratic Party platform was the way to go, I would vote for the Democrats, even though Kamala Harris seems to be able to do nothing but make word salad.
Hmm.
I would overlook the shortcomings of the individuals because I believe in the party,
Yeah.
right? And so the party beliefs, to me, for me to vote for a party, the beliefs would have to align with what I consider a Christian worldview. So, right, I mean, and you can see where the Democrats are very high on social justice, um, social causes, right? Social needs like welfare, taking care of the poor. They seem to have that locked down. Historically, Republicans seem to be on the side of less taxes. I like that. More conservative approaches, more conservative morally, more conservative socially, and so they have some biblical ideas going for them as well.
Yeah.
So and so I want to vote along party lines based on the worldview of the party that I think best embodies Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And no party is going to be perfect. Now the problem is what I've started to pay attention is that I'm listening to these talking heads right on TV,
Mm-hmm.
and they're talking about how the platforms for example, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party seem to be shifting. They almost seem to be trading places.
Yeah.
Like, the Republicans are more interested in they look on raising taxes more favorably than they used to, and the Democrats are now more than ever trying to be blue collar when that used to be the playground for the Republicans. So this is where I'm required. It's my responsibility to pay attention to what the party platforms actually are.
So you could have a Christian who is concerned about feeding the poor.
Mm-hmm.
You could have Christians who are concerned about making sure there's limited wars in the world, because ultimately that causes mass migration, that causes the loss of millions of lives. These things are all intertwined, but then we bump into other issues like abortion, and maybe that's, I do want to feed the poor, I do want to provide social services, but that's where I draw the line. How do we discern? Do we assign a weight to one of these issues or some of these issues? And then we make a choice based off of what is most important to God?
Another great question. That would be great if there was a specific guidebook of, this issue is worth this much. This issue is worth this much, and that's the challenge of trying to apply the Bible to issues that it doesn't speak to directly. I don't know. Again, this gets back to having thought through your worldview and in your own mind, making an assessment of what is most important for you. And if it is abortion trumps all, I the number of lives lost due to abortion are more are going to be more than any war. And if you want to be totally utilitarian about this and you're just counting bodies, then maybe the anti-abortion candidate is the way that you want to go. But I think that, again, this gets back to the individual and whether or not they can support their choices based on well-reasoned arguments that eventually link back to a biblical worldview. Yeah.
I think the wonderful thing is that we can make friends. I'm in the gym a lot. We can get to know people, as we've been talking about during this podcast, and politics never comes up. And we find out we have working out in common, or we like to go to this particular restaurant or this particular place in town. And we have so much in common, but for some reason, politics seems to be this incredibly divisive thing. It's almost like you could, lose a family member or a friendship over it. Why is that?
At this point, I will pile on the media. I will pile on the criticisms of the media. And I wonder how much of this division is stoked by the media, either looking for clicks or looking for sales. Right? This is money making because headlines grab attention, and the more divisive it is, the more newsworthy it is, all those sorts of things. So I wonder if it's just the media in their pursuit of attention that they create division.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And then I think the other one is the stakes. I think that because, and I mentioned this before, because the stakes are so high in terms of this is actually salvation at stake here.
Yeah.
And, and in some way, people don't want Christians chasing them down the road with the gospel, beating on them with the Bible, right?
Yeah.
Now I've got, people I know chasing me down the road with the Republican playbook. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. So it's the desperation or the concern of what's at stake. And there is a lot at stake, according to the secularists.
I think it's so important too, when we talk about politics, when we talk about these issues and how we relate together just as people, to remember that, yes, it is important to vote. I think it's a duty for each American that we should take it seriously.
Right.
We all already shared about, what someone may do if they've done everything they can and they can't determine which candidate they should vote for. But to remember that ultimately the leader that is going to be in the White House next January is going to be the leader that God has chosen.
Right.
We do play a role, but he's the boss.
Yeah, and I think this gets back to the idea of having both feet planted in two worlds, that regardless of what happens, so now we get into the question is, well, what do I do if my candidate is not chosen, right? Well, the first thing you do is you understand that God is still in charge.
Yeah.
That nothing changes in terms of the end game, which is the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
The kingdom of God is going to come about. And so as a Christian, I can be assured that regardless of what happens between now and the kingdom coming, the kingdom is going to come. And so that is very personally comforting to me.
Absolutely.
That God is still in charge. And so this is where, people come up to people talk to me and they go, yeah, we won. And, your candidate, they stink. And I'm thinking, that may be true, but, I'm not going to get all that excited about it. The other thing that you can do between now and after your candidate didn't win is now, again, you can choose to become more active, whether it's politically or socially. It was, I don't know if it was Tip O'Neill who first said this. I thought he was, but maybe he didn't. All politics is local, right? So if you want to effect the change that you wanted your candidate to do, you do it. Yeah. Get involved with whatever local group you can, and so you can get involved in local grassroots politics. Yeah. Or you can get involved in social groups that have nothing to do with politics, but are the social change. They represent the social change that you want to see.
Yeah.
And an example is the food pantry. So there are small things, local things that you can do to begin to bring about the change that you want to see for the country.
Yeah. And then there's the heart change too, isn't there? I mean, ultimately that's what God is seeking in each of us, is to ultimately change our hearts to be more like him.
Yeah. So it's the chicken. This gets back to this idea of the chicken or the egg. What comes first, my behavior or my heart change? Aristotle used to think that, well, if you do the things that you want to do in order to become virtuous, right, then you will become virtuous. So I could suggest to people, look, if you want your heart to change, do those things that you think will cause your heart to change, and then you'll grow into that more and more. And I think that there's a lot to that. Don't wait for your heart to change. Go do it anyway, and you'll find yourself more and more comfortable with it. And you'll find yourself doing other sorts of things more and more.
Yeah. I also have to say too, I can feel some animus, if I'm being honest, about people who have radically different political views than I do. And I just have to check myself once in a while, because I know if I check my heart, read my Bible, and I go deeper and not just be emotional about it, like you said, there are Christian ideas on both sides. There truly are.
Right.
Feeding the poor, caring for people in certain ways, and also sometimes things that we don't really think are helpful, but even like closing a border. I don't know if people understand the immense amount of pain and suffering that is happening from just having everyone be able to walk across without any issue. I mean, sex trafficking,
Right.
human trafficking. There's and then I'm challenged by myself or by the Lord to think, well, where did Joseph and Mary go? Didn't they cross the border of Egypt? There was no one there stopping them. What if there was? Would they have been killed? So I think it's so important to be open to balancing these different ideas, and also see people, like we've talked about, as created in the image of God, and not just as some kind of idea that you disagree with.
Yeah, what's interesting to me is how both Paul and Peter, encouraged us to pray for our leaders.
Mm.
And it's mind-boggling that they would tell us to do that, because they were both very familiar with the Roman, right, with Roman emperors of Rome, and how they had executed Christians. They killed Christians, and yet Paul and Peter both told us, pray for your leaders. And I'm thinking, well, wait a second. We have no I don't think we have a really good grasp on the persecution that the first century Christians had.
Yeah.
I don't think we have a good grasp on the social problems that they encountered, or that they had to live with. And we have this the sky is falling mentality. And I think it gets, back, like what you were saying, is that time out, take a break, get a sense of perspective on what's actually going on here, and do what you can. But bear in mind that God's in control. He's got the rulers where he wants them, and you do what you can to change whatever it is that you think you want to change, and then be patient and see how it plays out.
Well, Dr. Washatka, thank you so much for hanging out with us on the narrow road home. Loved learning more about secularism, worldview, moral relativism, and so much more. I really appreciate you coming on the program today.
Yeah, you're welcome, Daniel. It was a pleasure for me to be here.
Great. We'll see you again soon.
You bet.